chapter 15, book of Luke, chapter 15. This is Father's Day, and the message will coincide with that to some degree. There's hardly a day that goes by that I do not think of my father and miss him greatly. I'd like to read today in Luke 15. We'll read verses 1 and 2, and then verse 11. Then drew near unto him, that is Jesus, all the publicans and sinners, for to hear him. That was the purpose of gathering to him. And the Pharisees and scribes murmured, saying, This man, Jesus, receiveth sinners, and eateth with them. Then over in verse 11. And he said, A certain man had 2 sons. I don't know how many remember Brother Hancock, but Brother Hancock would preach a 30-minute introduction and then followed by a 10-minute message, and that's what we're going to do as well. What we read in verses 1 and 2 is the occasion of what follows, and it provides the emphasis and the central lesson of everything that follows. In verse 1, we see publicans and sinners drawing near to Christ to hear him. In verse 2, we see the reaction of the Pharisees to Christ receiving these sinners. They were upset. They were absolutely disgusted and appalled that Jesus received, welcomed, and ate with sinners. And they are complaining about it. And again, this becomes the occasion of everything that follows, verses 4 through verse 32. So again, the occasion of what is now before us is the Pharisees found it repugnant that Christ received sinners, and they're murmuring and they're complaining about it. Now, following what is said in verses 1 and 2, we read verse 3. And he, Jesus, spake this parable unto them, that is, unto the Pharisees and scribes who were appalled and murmuring about Christ receiving sinners. This is whom Christ is speaking to. So what prompted Christ to speak, what he said in verses 4 through 32, is what is recorded in verses 1 and 2. And that's very important to keep that in mind. So what follows, verses 4 through 32, is commonly viewed as 3 parables, with verses 4 through 7 has become to be known as the parable of the lost sheep. Verses 8 through 10 has come to be known as the parable of the lost coin. And then, of course, verses 11 through 32 is commonly known as the parable of the prodigal son. As we've stated before and shown before, we're not going to do that today. I believe that this is really one parable with 3 different parts. And we base that upon, you look at when Christ spoke multiple parables at the same time, it was clearly defined. Here it is not. I believe it's one parable with 3 parts. Really doesn't change anything. So, he spake this parable unto them. Verse 4 through 7, Christ speaks upon lost sheep. And then we come to verse 8, and it begins either, which is a word indicating a similarity or a link to the previous. He's continuing his thought. He proceeds through verse 10 to speak of a lost coin. And in both of these, the lost sheep and the lost coin, when they were found, there was great rejoicing. Now keep in mind whom Jesus is speaking to. The Pharisees and the scribes who were complaining, which served, so that these two parables serve, or two parts, serve as a rebuke to the Pharisees and scribes for their murmuring and complaining that Jesus received sinners, ate with them, and rather than rejoicing, they're complaining. And then we come to verse 11. And he, Jesus, said, again, continuing his train of thought, a certain man had two sons. So we know this certain man is a father. A certain man had two sons. And then he proceeds to tell us of these two sons and to tell of their father. And whether you view the passage as three separate parables or one parable with three parts, what is recorded in verses 11 through 32 is the climax of it all. It's the climax of it all. So what is recorded in verses 4 through 10, you have the lost sheep. Then you have the lost coin. And the prelude to all of that is verses 11 through 32. So back to verses 1 and 2, there are three characters. There is Christ. There are the sinners received by Christ. And there are the the Pharisees and the scribes. You go to verse 11, there are three characters. There is a certain man. He is the Father. And he is referred to by that title, Father, throughout the parable. There are two sons. They are identified, verses 12 and 13, as the younger and the elder. So you have a certain man, you have a younger son, you have an elder son. Three characters. In the process of time, the younger son became discontent, dissatisfied in his heart and mind with life with his father. And in the process of time, he became disgruntled with the ways of his father. In the process of time, he stopped enjoying his father's company. He stopped enjoying life with his father. And he began to think, I would be better off away from my father. And he began to feel that he was missing out on something in life. That there was more to life than life with his father. And one day, verse 12, in selfishness and greed, comes this defiant demand. Father, give me the portion of goods that falleth to me. He's asking for his inheritance. We read in verse 13 that the younger son gathered all together. That is his inheritance. He had what he thought were some excellent plans and ideas. And he took his journey. Sin, of course, is a journey from the Lord. Always. The younger son took his journey. In his mind, he's going to improve his life. You'll never improve your life away from God. Never. In his mind, he just knew that things were going to be better. In his mind, he was doing something finally for himself. And the younger son took his journey. What terribly sad words. He has left his father. He has what he thinks, again, are excellent plans and ideas, and he separates himself from his father. And he's filled with excitement as he begins his journey. There's great expectation. He's going to have a successful life. He's going to have a better life. This is what he's thinking, without a doubt. And he thinks that his father is in the way of this better life. Don't ever think that God is in your way for a better life. And the younger son took his journey. Now the journey would take him, verse 13, into a far country. And as we've stated before, he could not get to that far country unless he left his father. You can't get to the far country without leaving God. So, notice the words in verses 13 through 16. Just notice the word and. And, okay, he's taken his journey. Not many days after, the younger son gathered all together and took, there it is again, and took his journey into a far country, and there wasted his substance. You can't waste your substance with the father, with riotous living. And when he had spent all there, arose a great famine in the land, and he began to be in want, and he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country, and he sent him unto his fields to feed swine, and he would fain have filled his belly with the husk that the swine did eat, and no man gave unto him. That word "and" just simply means one thing led to another. And it just kept on. He took his journey, and one thing just led to another. And there he is, with a heart filled with self, with a disregard of his father, and he's wandering further and further away from his father. This journey would end in a life of waste. We read that he took his journey into a far country, and there, in the far country, wasted his substance with riotous or unruly, lawless, disorderly, out of control living. This is further brought out in verse 30, where it is said that he devoured, that is, the blessings of his father, his inheritance. He devoured it all with harlots. So he's leading a life of immorality, a life of filth, a life of wickedness, a life of rebellion. He lived to gratify the whims and the desires of his flesh. In the far country, he's living a life contrary to and in direct opposition and defiance to his father. It is a life of disregard of his father. It is a life of disrespect to his father, wasting his inheritance. In verse 14, we read concerning this younger son that after he had spent all, there arose a mighty famine in the land. And as a result of that famine, he began to be in want. Really, it wasn't the result of the famine that he began to be in want. It was a result of him leaving his father that he began to be in want. But he began to be in want. He's in a state of desperation. He's in a state of great distress. He's in a state of anguish and hopelessness. Now back home, there's plenty. Back home, there's comfort. Back home, there's rest. Back home, there's happiness. Back home is a loving and caring father. But then we read in verse 15 that this younger son joined himself with a citizen of that country, the far country. So his life is in shambles. He has nothing. And in verse 16, the hogs in the mire, eating the husks, had more than he does. But the story doesn't end there, which is a wonderful thing. This younger son would return home, and he would be welcomed and received by his father. Does that remind you of anything? Verses 1 and 2. The publicans and sinners received by Christ, welcomed by Christ. The Father would welcome His Son home, a picture of the sinners that Christ received. And again, the Pharisees and scribes are hearing this part of the parable, and no doubtly are disgusted and appalled at the behavior of the younger son. But the father received him. This brings us to the elder son. We read of him in verses 25 through 32. We'll not read those verses to save time. But when the younger son finally returned home, we read that the elder son was in the field serving and laboring. He's faithful, or at least he appears to be, just like the scribes and Pharisees. And we read then, as he came in from the field, that he heard music and dancing. He heard the sounds of celebration. And in verse 26, he called one of the servants and asked him what these things meant. And in verse 27, the reply came, "Thy brother is come." Thy brother is back. He's home. And thy father hath killed the fatted calf, because he hath received him. Remind you of anything? Verses 1 and 2 again. Christ receiving sinners. Thy father hath received him safe and sound. And in verse 28, we see the response of the elder son. And he was angry. Remind you of anything? Scribes and Pharisees. Angry at Christ receiving sinners. He was angry and would not go in. This elder son represents the scribes and the Pharisees. The younger son represents the sinners received by Christ. So this elder son, he could not find it in his heart to rejoice. He could not find it in his heart to give thanks. He could not find a word of praise in his heart. The only thing that was in his heart was anger and complaint, just like the scribes and Pharisees. I mean, after all, he stayed home. He appears to be faithful. He appears to be committed. But he has a terribly wrong attitude and spirit. He's hard-hearted. He's hateful. He's self-righteous. Hear him in verse 29. Lo, these many years do I serve thee. Neither transgressed I at any time thy commandment. Totally oblivious of the wrong spirit that he possessed. And notice verse 29, the emphasis upon self. And he answering said to his father, Lo, these many years do I serve thee. Neither transgressed I at any time thy commandment, and yet thou never gavest me a kid, that I might make merry with my friends. He's complaining, just like the scribes and Pharisees. The scribes and Pharisees should have rejoiced at Christ receiving sinners. Just like this elder brother should have rejoiced that his younger brother is home and he's been received by the father. But he's complaining. He's angry. He thought that he was more deserving of his father's love and blessing. Again, it's this, as we've preached it before, this elder son represents God's people more than the younger son represents God's people. Not many of God's people are going to go away and end up in the hog pen. Some do. But there are many, like the elder son, who are self-righteous and who think they deserve more. And, if they're honest, are angry when sinners are received, because after all, they're better. So this elder son represents the scribes and Pharisees. He viewed himself more righteous than his brother. He therefore concluded that he's more deserving of his brother. And he thought he was being treated unfairly. And he's angry because he didn't think he was getting what he deserved for his faithful service. In verses 29 through 30, he represents a spirit of superiority. I. He feels deserving. He feels entitled based upon his work. He was so angry, so jealous with his brother, that he did not even refer to him as my brother. But instead, in verse 30, he said, "This thy son." He didn't refer to him as his brother. He had a wrong spirit. He had a wrong attitude toward his father, this elder son. And he's filled with complaint. Just like the Pharisees and the scribes could not find it in them to rejoice that Jesus received sinners, so it was with this elder son. Just as the scribes and Pharisees were filled with disgust and animosity and disdain at the sight of Jesus receiving sinners, so it is with this elder son at the sight of his father receiving his prodigal brother. This elder son, again, epitomizes these Pharisees and scribes. And he's a vivid illustration of the character of the Pharisees and scribes. This elder son, like the Pharisees and scribes, what he looks like from outward appearance is completely different than what and who he really is. Two sons, two types of sinners, two sons, and a father. Three leading characters. Most make the younger son the main character. Therefore, it is called the parable of the prodigal son. The Scriptures don't call it the parable of the prodigal son. People call it the parable of the prodigal son. As we've stated in the past, I do not believe that the younger son is the main character. He's not the main character. Christ is addressing the Pharisees and scribes. Verse 3. And the elder son is them. So if you consider who is being addressed and why, the elder son is more of a main character than the younger son. And I believe that's so. It could really be called the parable of the elder son. It would really be more accurate than the parable of the prodigal son. But considering the subject matter, This man receiveth sinners and eateth with them. This man is Jesus. And he's portrayed by the Father in the parable. Referred to 11 times. The Father. And he is the main character. The Father's the main character. The subject of the message is the parable of the Father. And I believe that's more accurate than the parable of the prodigal son. And I believe the prodigal of the elder son is more accurate than the parable of the prodigal son. But really, when you get down to it, it's about the Father. The parable of the Father. And we want to look at this Father. And in Him there are lessons for all fathers. And there are lessons for all God's people. In the parable, He represents the Christ who welcomes and receives sinners. A parable is basically an extended metaphor. And in this case, it is an extended metaphor that expresses forgiveness, mercy that we have in the Lord. I have a Father who is the Lord. And He is beautifully portrayed in this parable. Again, verse 11, a certain man had 2 sons. He was a father to both of these sons, the younger and the elder. They were different, not just in age. They were different, and they had different needs, and the answer for both of them was found in the Father. The younger and the elder and the Father, the younger had what he needed in the Father. The elder had what he needed in the Father. The Father has what both need, and He ministers to the needs of both. And so it is with the Lord. He has what each of His sons and daughters need. And He ministers to the needs of His sons and daughters. Parents will say sometimes, I treat my children exactly the same. Well, if you do, you're foolish. That's foolish. They don't need exactly the same parent because they're different and they have different needs. This father was there for both the younger son and the elder son. The younger son left, but he was there when he returned. He was there. He was there. That's a father. He was there. In verse 20, we read that the father saw him, the younger son, when he was a great ways off. Perhaps he went daily to the highest part of his land, scanning the horizon for his son's return, because he's eager for his son's return. He's eager to forgive his son. It is Nehemiah 9:17, thou art a God, ready to pardon. God is my Father, and He's ready to pardon. Gracious and merciful, slow to anger, great kindness. That's my Father. That's the Father in this parable. In Psalm 103 and verse 8, the Lord is merciful and gracious, slow to anger, plenteous in mercy. Psalm 145 verse 8, the Lord is glorious, full or gracious, full of compassion, slow to anger, and of great mercy. And in verse 25 of in our text, following the Father ministering to the needs of the younger son, we read, now his elder son. Now his elder son. He's ministering to the needs of the younger son. Now his elder son has different needs. And in verse 28, we see his reaction is summed up in the words, that is the reaction of the elder son. He was angry and would not go in. But the father was there. And we read, therefore came his father out and entreated him. What's he doing? He's ministering to him. Different needs than his brother. And he's ministering to him. Oh, what a father we have that ministers to us in our needs, whatever they may be. And we all have different needs. We all have common needs. We all have different needs. He was a father to both. And so it is. God is a father to all, his sons and his daughters. He was a father of plenty, abundance, and sufficient supply. The younger son never had to leave to find what he needed in life. He had everything he needed with his father. The younger son never had to leave to find a better life. He had the best life there could be. At home with his father. At home with his father, when he got up in the morning, the father was there. When he worked during the day, the father was there. No matter what a day brought forth, he could see his father. He could feel his father's love and care. He lived his life under the father's influence. There was joy, there was comfort, there was fellowship that he could not have anywhere else. At home with the father. There was a place at his father's table. There was a banquet of the finest food. Oh, what a life we have with the Lord as our Father. And it's all because of Him. We see also He was a Father of unconditional love. In verse 20, He is there in love for His younger son, who had, with disregard and disrespect for his father, left him. In verse 20, there's the father. There he is. He's there in love for his younger son. In verse 28, he's there in love for his elder son, who was disgruntled and angry with the ways of his father. But his father came out in love and mercy and patience. So there's the father in love for him, the elder son. We see the father in love for the younger son. We see the father in love for the elder son. Oh, the wonder of God's fatherly love for all His sons and daughters. He was a father ready to welcome and to receive. Verse 20, again, here comes the younger son, having disrespectfully wasted what his father had given him. Here he comes. He's filthy. He's in rags. He smells like the pigs. He's empty-handed. He has nothing to offer to his father. And we read, his father. His father. What wonderful words. His father saw him in that condition. But his younger son is moving in the right direction. He's coming home. And his father had compassion and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. His father ran toward him eager to initiate forgiveness and reconciliation. And when the father reached his son, we read he fell on his neck and kissed him. He collapsed on his son in a massive hug, buried his head in the neck of his dirty, unpresentable son, and welcomed him. Just what Christ did in receiving sinners. In verse 28, there's the elder son. He's disgruntled and angry. Who's he disgruntled with? Who's he angry with? His father. That his father had received the younger son. So the father goes out and pleads with him. And there he is. He's ready to welcome and receive the elder son. In a different way, but he's still there ready to welcome and receive the elder son. He's a father of restoration. No matter who the sons and daughters of God are, we have a father who's ready to welcome them. No matter what they've done, no matter where they've gone, no matter where they've been, there is a father ready to welcome, to receive, and to restore him. In the Lord, we have a Father that is always there for us. No one can truly say the Father was always there. That's not possible. We know what people mean when they say that. And He is there as everything we need. He's there. And He's there as everything we need. He always loves us. He's always ready to welcome us and to receive us and minister to our needs. Providing us with a wonderful life of experiencing His love, His care, His kindness, His patience. A life of joy, comfort, and fellowship. What a Father. What a Father that you and I, the sons and daughters of God, have in the Lord. Brother Ben, if you'll come and lead us in a verse of song, let's all stand.